Here I'm part of the environmental law team at the law school. Just following on from Jeff's presentation, I'm also talking about the Paris meeting, but I'm using that as a basis to talk about intergenerational justice and climate change. And the whole notion of intergenerational justice has been central to my research for the last 5 years or so. Now you might think that's a bit of an odd thing to be researching, the idea of fairness between generations. It might sound like doing research on happiness, to be so vague as to be virtually meaningless. So what I wanted to do is just in a few minutes try and explain why intergenerational justice, I believe, is important, is of crucial importance. Now, Jeff set out for you very clearly some of the key issues in the Paris climate meeting, and he mentioned the tension there is in terms of international justice. So what is seen as a fair mitigation burden between countries, and there's real tension, of course, with countries like India that are battling with poverty. They understandably say it's unfair for them to have the main burden. It should appropriately fall on the wealthier countries that started the problem in the first place. But then there are real tensions, of course, practical problems, with now China being the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what's this got to do with intergenerational justice? If the process that's been put in train for Paris with this bottom-up approach results in an outcome which is, I think, very likely to occur, where if you add up all those individual country commitments, you don't have enough reduction in emissions to keep us below 2 degrees Celsius, which is seen as a boundary, if you like, in terms of serious risks of climate change, then this creates acute problems of intergenerational justice. And those arise for two reasons. Firstly, it will mean that the impacts of climate change, the risks will be imposed on future generations who played no role at all in creating the problem. So that's one source of unfairness, if you like. It also means that the longer we delay, and Jeff set out very well this sort of delaying tactic, the longer we delay in reducing emissions, the more burden that falls on future generations to reduce emissions, and the sharper the reductions will have to be, and Jeff's graph set that out very clearly. So there's a problem of passing the buck to future generations, if you like. Now, you might think intergenerational justice is very abstract, and it is in one sense, but it's also got a strong pragmatic dimension. And that is international relations research has demonstrated that you cannot get global agreements on environment issues unless there's at least some basic overlapping shared understandings of fairness. Without that kernel of understanding, you can't get agreement at all. And this is of enormous importance because I believe very strongly that you cannot, over the long term, address the climate change problem without a global agreement. And part of the reason for that is concern about trade competitiveness. This issue that Jeff mentioned, that countries say, well, hang on, we don't want to go first because it costs money reducing emissions, and our industry will suffer vis-a-vis our trade competitors. So to address that concern, I believe you do need a strong global treaty. Now, there are two very thorny issues in trying to flesh out what intergenerational justice might mean in the climate context. One is how to balance fairness between generations, intergenerational justice, with international justice, fairness between countries. Now, you might international justice, the problem of countries like India addressing poverty, might lead you to argue that it's a fair thing for countries like India to delay reducing emissions because they have pressing concerns to address a few 100 million people who have who are in dire poverty now. The problem you run up against is that if that continues too long, then we end up, because of the total share of global emissions, you end up with an ineffective climate regime that pushes us over the 2 degrees Celsius. And if you do that, then the burden of those policies will fall most harshly on the future poor. The future poor will be the ones that suffer most. So how do you strike a balance between international and intergenerational justice? Another really interesting problem that I found fascinating is just the whole problem about how do you identify some common understandings of what justice means with people from different cultures, countries and backgrounds. I believe in my writings I've tended to rely quite a lot on the idea of there being core human rights and relying on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, for instance, which all countries now at least formally subscribe to. That of course leaves open questions, because a human rights approach alone won't help you address the distributional justice related issues that I've mentioned. Human rights in itself cannot address that. You've got to invoke some notion of justice. I just wanted to mention briefly how I've ended up doing research in this area. Why have I ended up doing research in this area? It seems a little odd in a way, because I worked as a career diplomat negotiating global environment agreements for 8 years in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And now my former colleagues are a bit confused why I've ended up writing a lot about abstract ethics and justice stuff. What on earth has this got to do with the real world? There are some connections though. One major motivation is that when I started reading into the climate change science literature, I became really deeply disturbed about the sort of planet that we're leaving our children and grandchildren. Another reason I got interested in this field is that I discovered that that international law, and international law is my background, international law, as with many other academic disciplines, tend to work in silos. So there's not enough interdisciplinary work, and there are real barriers to doing that. There are barriers in terms of the rewards you get in terms of the university systems for research. There are also barriers in terms of expertise. Climate change is difficult because it involves science, ethics, justice issues, law and economics. So it's difficult straddling these areas. At the same time, I've found if you do venture out of your own area, there are fascinating connections you can make between the different areas, and that's something I've found really interesting to do. In terms of my intergenerational justice research, if you'll pardon the self-promotion, that ended up in the book last year, and I've got flyers here for if anybody's interested. It's now available in paperback, under £20. So excuse that terrible self-promotion. So the book was mostly focused on substantive justice between generations. My latest interest is procedural justice, and I've become deeply interested in how can you create institutions that purport to represent future generations. And if you stop and think about it, you'll be familiar with some of these types of institutions. At the national level, there are commissions for sustainable development in various states of Australia, and the ACT and Victoria, for instance. Some countries, Finland has a parliamentary committee for the future. And knocking around in the UN system, there's a proposed United Nations High Commissioner for Future Generations. And that proposal I've done some work on some of the normative underpinnings of that proposal. Does it make sense for an institution to purport to represent those that are not yet born, or does that involve a whole lot of arrogant assumptions that we know what's best for those that are going to come after us? There are also a lot of interesting questions. My latest research on it is looking at democratic legitimacy and those types of institutions. If international institutions need to be legitimate in some way, is it appropriate to require them to be democratic in some way? And the essence of democracy is that you take into account the interests of those who are affected by decisions. How can you do that in relation to persons that are not yet born? I think there are good answers to that, but that's the area that I've become really interested in. I should mention that the last couple of years I've really enjoyed enormously getting involved with the ethics, justice, philosophy crowd. I've tended to end up being a token lawyer, international lawyer at a number of workshops run by the Ethics Institute at Utrecht University in the Netherlands that's been running over the last few years a whole network of philosophers, mostly philosophers, but also some legal, economics and other disciplines, on a really interesting project on human right to a green future that combines human rights thinking and with also looking at practical sort of issues. Just to wind up, I should mention that I've been really spoiled, if you like, to be working at this law faculty, where I've received tremendous support in my research over the recent years. And also it's been really encouraging to see the tremendous growth and increasing strength of the environmental law team here, particularly the recent appointments of Jeff, who you've just heard, and Ben Richardson, that join already some impressive people, Jan, that you'll be hearing from shortly, and some of my other colleagues. So I'll just leave. Are there any questions? Thank you.